In this video, I want to briefly skip the mechanics of accounting and just go straight into the journal and give you an introduction of how the journal works in my accounting system. But before I do, I wanted to mention that we have this kind of situation where we understand that it is referred to as double entry bookkeeping or double entry method of accounting, but it is a bit misleading because we have computers, databases, and software. We have to think of transactions and operations, which means we now have to think of in combined debit and credit entries for any particular operation. And that means that there's a question of sales tax. And the answer to the question of sales tax when it comes to operational transaction in that moment, when the user creates an invoice, for example, which results in multiple journal entries being made into the journal. This is going to be made very easy to understand. The README file for the project that I'm working on contains the select statements needed to understand how the data is being treated in the database. And also within my project, I have a convenient way of resetting the project to a predetermined state so that to create the invoices and select the addresses for the customers and the inventory items, I don't need to enter that information. I have that information as part of the create script to insert some sample data. This is a very simple system. It is a multi-tenant system. There is a very basic and easy to use login. And at the second step of the login process, there is a way for you to choose the organization. If you're going to be running multiple organizations and you want to limit access to certain areas of your businesses. You might have an accountant, and that accountant should only have access to one company, but you might own more than one company. So this is a convenient way to choose under which company you want to log in as, and this is also where you would create a new organization. So choose organization completes the login process. As you can see, there's your email, your username, and the organization that you are logged in under. You can also go into the change organization and switch the organization, and this will have a completely different data, a whole new chart of accounts, different invoices, different customers and inventory items. But the first one has the sample data that we need to create the invoice. So let's take a look at what it looks like when we create an invoice. If I just go into create invoice and I start typing in the name of the customer, and then I select the customer. There's more than one customer. This is an autocomplete. You have an up and down arrow keys to navigate, to make your final adjustments. This kind of drop down is used throughout the application. Very easy to use, very easy to not have to use the mouse in some cases. You don't have to move your hand to the mouse, so you can fill out a lot of these forms. The invoice, although usually there's going to be supporting documentation, which means you're going to need to add attachments to your application. When you add attachments to your application, that's a whole different video. But we're going to pick one customer. We're going to pick a different billing address. Like I said, there is sample data and I have different shipping address, so you have a choice because these drop downs, some of them are custom and they need to have a custom way of selecting the item. So here, again, up and down arrow keys allows you to fine tune your selection, and then pressing enter would make that selection. The inventory items are very interesting because when the inventory item is added into the system, the inventory system requires you to understand a little bit of accounting so that at least you know into what account to recognize the revenue recognition. So here, for example, we're going to do an invoice with 2 line items because an invoice with 2 line items is a bit more difficult to understand than an invoice with 1 line item. You might come to the same conclusions with 1 line item, meaning if we're strictly talking about debit and credit entries and you have to figure out which debit and which credit entry you have to make, those entries usually have an amount, and having the invoice amount, if you're creating an invoice with 1 line item, ends up with just 2 journal entries, debit and credit, at the most minimum. And for example, if a sales tax has to be collected, which I do not have because I don't need to collect sales tax, but you could very easily add, following the same pattern that I have in my application, you could easily add sales tax. In fact, I am working on the sales tax component right now, which is going to be part of a greater taxes, fees, and discounts architecture. But when we consider an invoice